Welcome back to another episode of Learning Vue.js the hard way, which essentially means that we are learning Vue.js by simply reading through the documentation. And we are now about to talk about binding inline styles. We're in the section of class and style binding. So in other words, what we've been talking about for the last two or three videos, I guess. This is the third video, whatever. In the last few episodes, we've been talking about style. So we've been talking about CSS, in other words, how to get CSS into your Vue applications. In other words, how to style your Vue applications, right? How to reactively, how to dynamically style your Vue applications. So not just how to put CSS on top of your Vue application, right? Like you just loading in a CSS file. Of course, you can do that, right? But that's not what we're talking about now. We're talking about sort of dynamically, sort of rendering CSS based on whatever is in your data models, right? Reactively, right? And then whenever you change that data model, the CSS will update in your views because again, Vue is reactive, or Vue.js is reactive. Okay, so more specifically, what we're going to talk about today is inline styles, right? And what this means is essentially that it means we're going to talk about the style attribute. Let's just jump into the index file that we've been using here. So let me just emphasize here that let's just pick something arbitrary. Again, let me just mention also before we dive into this that as I mentioned in the last video, stay with me, survive through this messy application for one more video, and then in the next video we will start to clean this up and rewrite a simple to-do application and then use that as an example as we move on forward, right? Because now we've sort of just been throwing in too much random stuff into this application, and I'm feeling we're sort of losing semantics, right? It's sort of becoming difficult to talk about things without having to sort of explain like what the heck we're doing with all this strange stuff. So we'll get into that in the next one, but survive this one and we'll get into the to-do stuff. Okay, so let me just pick something arbitrary here. Here we have a UL element. Actually, do we have a class statement somewhere? Right, we have a class statement here and here, right? So here we have a binding, and here we have here we have a regular class, and here we have a binding, and here we have a regular class statement, right? But let me actually pick something else. Let's pick this this UL element. What I mean is that if we specify the class attribute in HTML, that's what we've been talking about in the last few videos. What we, however, now are going to talk about is the attribute style, right? So that's inline styling. Let me show you this, right? Let's open up the application. I mean, of course, you're familiar with this, but let's just touch ground so that we sort of are all on the same page. Actually, let me close these. Okay, sorry, there's leftovers from trying to figure some stuff out before I started this video. But okay, so here's our application that we've been working with so far. Let's just look. What we've been sort of toying around with is this idea of a party mode. So when you click this party mode button, I know this is a stupid example, and this is why we're moving into to-do application after this. But then sort of this portion here and this portion here is sort of they are turned red, essentially, right? When we turn on this supposed party mode. I don't know why that would be like a party mode, but whatever. Now, a style attribute, or sorry, what I should say is that notice that we've been achieving this by adding a class to them. So if I open up the inspector here and zoom in so that we can look at the classes that are actually applied to this particular element in the DOM, then you can see that, okay, well, here we have a UL list, and that UL list is comprised of two LI children, right? Sorry, I said two, I meant three. Okay, three LI children, right? And these all have class attributes, or each of them have the class attribute. And in that we have, in the class attribute, we've specified the classes static inside and static outside. Those were just some examples that we were working with last time. And actually, I think we could actually remove those. So here we have static outside. Let's remove that. Let's search for static. And then the other ones are inside. So let's go to main.js. Here we have static inside. Let's remove that. And do we have any more static? No. Okay, so fine, right? So let's just drop those because we don't have to think about that, because that was an example from last time. So if I now refresh, no, wait, we still have static outside. Maybe I just forgot to save this. I'll save this, refresh, right. So now we have LI elements. We have the existence of the class attribute, but we have no values passed to that, right? We don't have any set classes. However, if we turn on party mode, you can see the class party suddenly shows up, and that's why they turn red. Or rather, they turn red because we've specified in our sort of inline style sheet sheet up here in the top, we've specified that the class party means that the text color should be red. So there's this sort of combination of the definition of the class party and the fact that we put the class party onto those elements. So let's now try to use inline styles instead. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to remove this party class, right? We're removing the definition, the CSS definition of the party class. And now if I save that and refresh, you can see like visually in terms of being red or not, it doesn't matter if I click the button. Like there's nothing's turning red. However, we do still like sort of add on the party class. We do still add the party class to each of these li elements and also to this p tag up here in the top whenever we press, whenever we turn party mode to true. So I mean the view binding stuff is all working fine. It's just that now we don't have any actual class that sort of is called party, and hence there is in sort of CSS terms, there's nothing that can happen. So how would we go about if we would do this as inline styles? Well, to use inline styles, let's just sort of hard code it at first, right? What if we would say that a cart item has a style property? Whoa, what is up with this? Sorry, wait, my automatic sort of what is that called? Like indenter, like my editor that wants to indent. Yeah, okay, so it was probably this empty attribute that threw it off. Sorry, that's those totally specific error. Let's not think about that. Okay, so if I tack on a style attribute here, now I'm just assuming that I can put a style attribute on this thing even though it's a component, right? Because as we looked at last time, it seems like whatever attributes you set on your component, Vue will simply pass those on to the root element of the thing that's being rendered from when rendering your component. So in other words, your root element in your component, or sorry, I meant to say the root element of your template, the root element of your template that belongs to that component. So the component has a template, and that template has a root element, which is like HTML is a tree, so every template starts with one particular element, and every DOM has a single root element, just like HTML. In HTML, the root element is HTML. So yeah, HTML is hierarchical, right? Hang on. Woof, sorry, cat hair in my mouth. Too much information. Let's move on. So yeah, I'm just assuming that if I add style here, then they will simply pass that on to the root element. So let's try that out. So if I say style, and then we'll say something like color : red semicolon, right? That's some valid CSS. So let's try that out. If I refresh, you can see that actually works, right? And you can see here that the style has been added to each of these individual li items. Now, of course, importantly, right? Very importantly, this has nothing to do with Vue, right? What we're exploring now is the fact that in HTML you can put inline styles on elements, right? And if you're totally unfamiliar with this, just Google for inline styles CSS HTML, right? And you can read up on this. Nothing strange, right? We can add a bunch of inline styles here. Like we could say, okay, text decoration, let's say underline, for example, and a semicolon, and then refresh, and then you can see now these list items are red and we've underlined them. Super cool. And of course, like then there's this whole discussion. I guess that's also pretty important discussion, right? As in that, why would you want to put inline styles, right? So historically, there's been this sort of like originally people started by using elements such as the B tag, so for bold, like the I tag for italics, and I mean there are a bunch of more like that. I'm trying to remember. Yikes, it's been like, this is like, I mean, it's, yeah, this is even a long time for me. But anyways, I mean, it's way back, people used elements to determine what the visuals of different things should be. Right? The BR tag is another example of that, like a line break, right? We very seldom use a line break now because we're rather sort of semantically so nowadays we want the HTML to be a semantic representation of the structure of the content, right? It's like, well, here you have a header and here you have some paragraph followed by another paragraph followed by a link to some other document, followed by another paragraph, followed by a subheader, and so forth, right? Like those are sort of semantically meaningful things. And then you can think about boldness, like a bold text as being extra important or extra emphasized or something like that, right? So that's sort of the way we want to think about our HTML. So there was this sort of journey from like, okay, well, you had these very visual elements such as bold. Bold is a pretty bad example because we're still sort of using bold, I guess sometimes. But yeah, again, like you can argue that that has sort of semantic meaning. But then and then we started to move into style things, right? Or like the style attributes. So then people would tack on style attributes to things and then just describe how they would be styled. But then a step away from that, like after that, we started to move into the territory where we said, well, okay, actually, let's separate these things. Let's say that we have the DOM, we have the HTML elements, like that's one document, and then we pair that with a style sheet, right, which specifies the styles. Because in some sense, like the visual representation of the DOM is not really relevant to the semantic representation. Like what the document means in a machine sense, like when a machine is looking at that, or like I can't remember what these are called, but it's like screen readers, or like so let's say you're blind, right, and you have an algorithm that reads a page and then tries to describe that page to you, not like visually, but like an algorithm that tries to do sort of text-to-speech synthesis, and it would be easier for that thing if it could just identify what parts are actually parts of the article, let's say, and what parts are like ads or menus or whatever. Like it would be easier if that thing could determine that by reading the HTML rather than having to sort of somehow like visually figure out what parts are what parts. So that's sort of this divide of like, well, let's describe some semantic HTML, semantically meaningful HTML, and then let's tack on some style sheet to that. So let's separate these two things. Okay, this is turned into a quick side note. If this all makes sense to you, just skip forward a bit, right? But I think this is actually contextually pretty important for these ideas, because then there was this sort of revamp. In my mind, it seems that it was a lot because of React, right? There's this great, I can't remember, somebody from React in a presentation said something like that somebody, I think it was like DHH, the guy who invented Rails, Ruby on Rails, or initially wrote Ruby on Rails, who had said something like React rethinking best practices, and I think he said that sarcastically. I'm sorry if this was not the HH. I didn't mean to misquote or misrepresent, right? I mean, maybe it's him, maybe it's not, but who had said like React, rethinking best practices, and I assume he said that sort of sarcastically, as in that, well, we've learned this great idea or we have this great idea of separating like the HTML from the CSS, and we've sort of lived by that for a very long time, and and I guess then he would argue that that's a great idea, but then sort of React comes along and sort of suggests that we should rethink that idea, which is then again like maybe not a good thing. It's like, well, we know this thing, like don't fix what's broken, right? But then somebody from the React community brought that up in a presentation and said, well, actually, let's embrace that. That's great. That's what we're doing, right? We're actually rethinking best practices because maybe there's a better idea. I think that was a sort of a great moment. That was a great argument, at least in my mind, of like, well, actually, maybe I should listen to them, right? Because maybe they're right in that maybe the thing that we thought was best practice is actually not super great. And then they were arguing for a usage of sort of inline styles, right? Let me just let the cat out and I'll be right back. Sorry, it's pretty tricky when it's raining, right? Because it's like the cats are blaming me for the rain because they're whining when they're inside, but then they sort of don't want to go outside and they stay out for like 2 minutes and then they come back in and whine again. So anyways, let's move on. So let me wrap up this story, right? The point was just that we've sort of gone full circle where we're sort of back, no, not back into like elements that have specific styles, but back full circle to inline style sheets, right? Where there are actually some good arguments as to why you should not place your styles in CSS files that are sort of reused across the whole application and completely disconnected from the HTML. Maybe you should actually use inline styles, because in some sense, if you think about it from like the screen reader perspective, or that we talked about, right? Like having HTML that's sort of semantically sensible, you can still have that. You can still have HTML that is semantically sensible, because we know, like a machine would know what parts are part of the visuals. That's whatever is in the style attribute. So it's already well isolated, right? It's not like the style stuff is sort of leaking into the rest. Leaking into the rest of the application. It's actually still, or it's actually already sort of encapsulated or well isolated. So that's not really the problem, right? So the problem then is more something along the lines of for example, reuse, right? It's like, well, okay, but if I have like these three li elements and I want to apply the same style to them, if I use inline styling, I'll have to say the same thing 3 times, and that's of course extremely prone to errors. But when we are now in this sort of component land, right? When we're starting to work with components, where it's like, well, I'm defining this component that's called a cart item, and then I can add a style to cart item. Well, I mean, that's a whole different beast, right? Because then that's actually pretty isolated. Then like it's even like the argument is completely reversed. It's like, well, taking the styles and putting them in a separate style sheet suddenly kind of sounds like the wrong idea, because why would you do that? If you want to have something that's self-contained, you really want to have something that's self-contained, right? Like, is it really self-contained if it doesn't, if it looks catastrophic, like visually catastrophic, without applying styles, right? It's like kind of like, if you think about it as like, if you've used jQuery, right? Like back in the days, with all these jQuery plugins, right? So you pull in this jQuery plugin, and then they're like, yeah, just run the code, except you also have to put this image file in this folder, and this image file in this folder, and then you need to load this CSS file, and then you need to make sure to use this class, and like whatnot, right? That's not self-contained. Now, like components here in Vue are sort of, if I remember correctly, right? They're heavily inspired by the web component specification, right? And then we're talking about truly fairly well self-contained, like units that can actually be reused, that have styles that are defined within them, right? So like now I'm saying the style attribute, I'm specifying the style attribute here on the component, but what I'm saying is that this style attribute, while we can specify it here, we could also specify it inside the component, right? So then I don't even have to say how this thing should be styled, right? It sort of is just styled on the basis of how it's styled inside, right? It specifies its own style within it. I'm sorry, I hope I'm sort of making sense. And because we have cart item defined as a component like this, where the template is just a single string, then for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to use this sort of root component, right? Our main app. I'm going to put a style attribute on something here. Actually, I think we'll put it directly here on the cart item, and then maybe we'll move it inside the component. Because again, otherwise it's a bit tricky to see when we have that template as a long string. But yeah, so yeah, let me wrap that up. Hopefully you can see how there's this sort of, I wouldn't say that's clear cut, right? I think both of these sides have very good points, but I'm sort of kind of leaning towards the idea of having components that are truly self-contained and hence define their own styles, right? And if you want to have something that's, let's say configurable, then you can just pass those things as props down into the component. But anyways, okay, let's drop this now. So what were we doing? Let me undo backwards because I removed this style attribute, right? So we have this style attribute with this sort of these two inline style statements inside of it, and that's what makes this list go red and make the text of each item underlined, right? And notice again, these are styles that are individually applied to each individual li element. Now, what's the point? Well, the point is, of course, that we could use binding. I don't think, again, we can probably not use the sort of mustache binding inside of attributes like this. I believe we've tried this before. maybe we should actually try that. So let's do this. Let's say that we add to our data model in the JS file, we add, let's say, a party color property, and we'll set that to red, let's say, right? So we're trying to, or actually, let's switch to blue, right? So we notice when the change happens. Okay, so now we've set this party color property. Let's go back to the index.html file, and let's change inside this style, or like the value that's being passed to this style attribute, and let's change that then to color colon, and then what we want to do is we want to bind to party color, right? So I don't think this is going to work, but let's just try this to ensure that again, like as we talked about last time, right, that our hypothesis is correct. Let me refresh. Yeah, you can see it doesn't work. And if we look at what's rendered here in the DOM, the class attribute has no value, right? So you can't use mustache syntax like this. So back to the Vue documentation. How do we do it? Well, what we do is that we use this object syntax. Now, we have to be careful here because it's not exactly the same thing as object syntax for classes. Because remember, object syntax for classes says that you specify a key, and that's the name of the class that you want to render, but you want to render it conditionally on the basis of whether the value that key is pointing to, or that expression, computes to true or false. Like if the expression computes to true, then you render then you add the CSS class with the same name as the key. Right, but here, what we're talking about here is that, well, the left hand side, the key in this, or like every key in this object is a CSS property, and then the value that this key is pointing to represents the value that should be passed to that CSS property. So it's not this sort of conditional rendering idea. It's simply, well, the value that I want to pass to this property is based on this particular variable that I have in my data model, or more generally, this particular expression, right? As you can see here, they're actually making an expression, or expressing an expression here where they're saying take the font size variable, but also concatenate that. So treat that as a string and concatenate that with the word px, right, for pixels. So it's like if the font size variable is 12, then you would put out 12 pixels, right? Because in CSS you actually have to specify pixels, because there are also like EMs and REMs and so forth. Like there are different ways of expressing font sizes, or actually, I mean, like expressing numbers, I guess, or distances and sizes, maybe I should say. Anyways, so what we did here now, this doesn't work, right? So what do? We have to use the object syntax. So we add an object, and then we simply say color colon, right? Because color is the CSS property, and then we pass our we pass an expression, right? But the expression that we want to have is that we want to pass the name of the property in our data model, and that was party color, right? So let's just try that. Let's refresh. That didn't work. Style is equal to color colon party color. I'm actually a bit surprised about why that didn't work. I thought that would work. Let's just see what we're messing up here. Oh, okay. So, silly me, right? Silly me, right? Because what we need to do is we need to say v bind the attribute style, of course, right? Because how would you know that it's going to interpolate otherwise? Let's refresh, and it's blue, right? So what I missed is vbind, of course. And then, of course, we can use this shorthand notation by not specifying vbind. Let me just take this and move it down here, because we have a bunch of bindings here, right? Here we're binding style, here we're binding item, and here we're binding in party mode. Okay, so let's save that. Let's refresh. I wonder why we have in party mode. That's probably something that, let's just look at, like, I guess that's not even used anymore. Yeah, we conditionally render the class. This doesn't even work, it seems. We conditionally render the class. No, we do it because, no, okay, of course it works. It's just that whether we're in party mode or not. So that's just like stuff from last time, which doesn't have any effect now because we've removed the CSS class party. So even if we turn on the class party, like nothing happens on the basis of that, because we're not actually responding to the class party. So maybe let's actually remove that as well, right? So let's remove up to here. And then let's go into main.js, and let's go to the top here, and let's remove the prop in party mode. We don't need that anymore. and then we don't need to conditionally render this class, right? So then our template becomes a lot simpler. So let's save that, let's refresh, and now when we click set party mode, yeah, nothing is happening except up in here, right? Up in the P tag up here, we're actually toggling party mode. So maybe we should change that as well, right? Let's go to the top here. Let's see, where do we have? Okay, so that's part of the title. So here we've bound to the computed property title style, right? We've bound the class attribute to the computed property title style. So let's jump to main.js. Let's look for title style here, and that essentially just returns this dot party style, right? What is this dot party style, right? And this dot party style is essentially this thing, right? So let's yeah, I guess maybe let's keep these computed properties, right? Instead of messing around with the HTML, this is a good place to change these later. So let's change that, or let's keep that for the title here. Of course, there's again, like, one should do a lot of harmonization because our application currently looks like a walking catastrophe. But again, we'll get into that next time. So okay, now let's get into this point. What I want to do is I want to have this blue color now actually be switched on and off on the basis of party mode. And not just have this list always be true, right? So how do we do conditional stuff then? Well, I guess we could switch back and forth between red and blue, right? Or sorry, black and blue. So if we do it very simply, we could just go to where we are saying that color is party color, right? Here we could probably, because it's an expression, we could probably say if party, then party color, otherwise black, right? This should probably work. Let's refresh. Yep, the color is now currently black. If I set party mode to true, color is now currently blue, right? And then we can switch back and forth. But of course, we could probably do this in more elegant ways. And since this, like the style property, as we were talking about the other videos, right? Now we're sort of inlining the inline style here. But we could also just say that, let's change that for, let's say, cart item style. Let's save that. Let's go over to main.js and add a computed property that's called cart item style. Again, maybe this should be part of the component actually, but let's take that in a moment. And then I guess let's just return and paste the same thing in that we had inline before, right? I'm saving this one. I'm going to index.html. I'm saving that one, and I'm refreshing. Oh, and we have some errors. Party is not defined, right? Of course, sorry, because here we of course then need to say this dot party and this dot party color, right? Because now we are no longer in the template, so I have to be explicit about using this because we are it's about what is in scope. So when we're in a computed property, we need to say this because we're accessing things on the data model, and Vue makes that available under this. So let's refresh that. And now it should still work, and it still does, right? Let's close the console for now. So what's the next step? Well, I guess the next step would be to refine this. Aha, and I think this is a great time to move to the next one. I think you've sort of understood this portion about the object syntax, right? And again, as here they're showing exactly what we showed now, where you can take, instead of expressing something inline, you can extract it to, for example, a computed property or maybe just a data model property, and then return that. And then bind to that instead, right? Instead of sort of inlining the whole thing, which probably makes a lot of sense. Okay, and then let's jump to the next syntax here, right? Still for style, still for inline styles. The next thing is array syntax, and array syntax for styles is a lot more like array syntax for classes, right? Because array syntax for classes was just saying that, add on whatever things you have in the first element in the array, and then add on whatever classes you have in the second one, and then whatever you have in the third one, and so forth, right? The interesting point here, though, is that they have this very great, like very, very telling example, right? Because the first thing that the first element in the array that they're binding to is called base styles, and the second element is called overriding styles. So they're sort of implying that you could also use this for defining some base styles first, passing that first, and then pass some local styles that potentially, like potentially override the base styles. So design-wise, like that might be an interesting thing to do. And then again, like as we've talked about in other videos, you might then even want to do something like extract out those styles and share them between different components, right? Maybe. Again, now we're sort of back in this discussion of like, well, how much should be shared across components, right? Or I mean, they would still be, yeah. Let me not go there, right? I mean, you could probably still make them extremely well isolated and extremely well not encapsulated. The word I'm looking for is compartmentalized. The same word I was using before, right? I can't remember, but oh yeah, the confusion. Self-contained. Oof. Sorry, I maybe I killed your ears in your speakers. I apologize for that. Okay, self-contained was the word I was looking for, right? So depending on the level of self-containedness that you're looking for, you might not necessarily want to share it across different components. But again, like I think you can do it in ways that still ensure that all your things are extremely self-contained, right? Yeah, for sure. I mean, because of imports and all of that stuff. Okay, that's a different discussion. So we can use this array syntax. So I actually think this array syntax could be very suitable right now, right? Because what we could say is that we could say, well, actually, we defined party style up here, and that seems to be like something. Whoops, that seems to be something that we wanted to share between different things before, when we sort of added on the class, because like title, both the title and the cart item would both be using party style, and so then we didn't want to specify this conditional logic twice. We wanted to simply specify it once and then share that thing across both scenarios. So let's try to do that again. Let's just take this cart item style, like the implementation of that, and just move that up to party style. And actually think about this, right? What we are doing is actually exactly the same thing, right? Before we were doing this, but now we are doing this. So in a class, in a class world, right? When we're defining a CSS class, like when we're using object notation for a CSS class, what this means is that we're saying render the class party if this dot party happens to be true. But what we're saying now is that set the CSS property color, like in your style element, style attribute, to the value of this dot party color if this dot party happens to be true. But if this dot party happens to be false, then just simply set it to black instead. All right. So these sort of have they have similar. They essentially encode the same idea, but the old example, this example, the class example, was dependent on the existence of a class. And this is sort of when you're reaching this point where there's another point of possible failure, right? Because there's another layer of indirection that isn't necessarily, in my mind, it isn't necessarily sort of sought for, right? Because if there is a disconnect, then probably that's because of an error, not because you actually wanted to have that disconnect. Like if you misspell a class or whatever. So instead, I mean, we can still achieve the same sort of reusability across multiple scenarios, or even, as we talked about now, just, like across multiple components, but now we are using code instead of using CSS. So, you know, give and take. It's an interesting point for sure. Okay, so now we've implemented party style, but now party style must be used in the context of style and not in the context of class. So that means we have to go back to index.html and while we remember it, right? Remember to move title style here from class to style, right? Now we want to bind to the style property and not to the class property. Let's go back to main.js, right? And that's the title style is this thing, right? Because notice that the implementation of title style is just that it returns party style. And now cart item style can also just return this dot party style, right? Maybe I could just put make these one-liners to save some space. Maybe that was a bit unnecessary. Who cares? Okay, so and this is, again, like speaking of indirection, right? The reason I'm using title style and cart item style is, okay, at least some part in me is trying to maintain design, even though we're sort of just catastrophically messing around. I wouldn't want to bind them directly to, I mean, maybe you would, right? I was going to say I wouldn't want to bind title here directly to party style, because then if I want to have multiple things in the title, I then have to change the HTML rather than the JavaScript. But yeah, then again, sorry. I mean, if you have this scenario that we have now, where like the title style doesn't actually compose multiple different things, like it's just exactly the party style, and where the car item style is not also not composing any things, it's just exactly the party style, then whatever, right? I mean, it might make sense to just delete these and bind the two things to directly to party style instead of having this sort of layer of indirection. Hang on. Excuse me. Okay, so let's actually do that in a moment. What I wanted to show first is that most probably, I guess this would work. Let's try this out. Let's refresh and let's set party mode. Bazinga, right? Blue here and blue here. And what's really cool about this, right, is we can change party color here. Party color, change that in our data model to red. Set party mode to true. Now we're red, right? It's changing in all the places. And even, like we could even say non-party color here, of course. Let's set that to black. Of course, again, like you would want to scope this somehow. Maybe that should be like in a style object so that we're not sort of mixing our sort of visual variables with our sort of very important data variables and all that. So then we can change this black value to this dot non, or let's maybe say base color, right? Instead of non-party color. Non-party, so let's, yeah, I even misspelled it. So let's say base colors. The base color is black and then the party color is red. Let's refresh that. This should still work. We're going from black to red, right? But we can now change black to, let's say, purple. And then, yep, we're defaulting to purple, but then when I set party mode, we go to red, right? So pretty cool stuff, right? Pretty powerful stuff, I would say. Okay, so the thing I wanted to show about this array syntax is then, of course, that we could also do this now. We could say, okay, let's say that the cart item, for the cart item style, we're not just returning party style, we're returning party style as the first element in an array, or rather, we're returning an array where party style is the first element, and then the second element is, let's add this, right? It's an object that contains maybe, let's say, a text decoration colon underline, right? As we were doing before. Close the object, close the array, and now these two things should be merged, right? We should have both of these styles. Let's refresh. Okay, now you can see it's underlined even when we're not in party mode. But then we enter party mode, and it's red and underlined. So it stays underlined at all times. Let's inspect this and let's just see what the HTML looks like, right? So here you can see style is equal to color is red and text decoration is underlined. If I set party mode to false, color is purple and text decoration is underlined. Cool stuff, right? Cool stuff. So, I mean, yeah, not bad, right? And I mean, if you then would want to conditionally render something, meaning that you would like not have the attribute, right? Because now we were able to sort of switch back between a default color and a color, but sometimes you may want to sort of have the existence of that CSS attribute or not. And then, I'm not sure, do we call them attributes in CSS? I guess you call them, or maybe properties, CSS properties, right? Like, is color a property or an attribute? Anyways. Maybe you just don't even want to render it, right? Like, let's say when we're in purple mode here, maybe we want that to be like non-existent. We just want to not specify any particular color. Then you could probably use this array style, right? And then you either render, so let's do that, right? We could say, let's say this dot party, then the first element is party style, otherwise it's empty string. I guess this would work, right? Let's refresh. Yep, and then you can see we just have text decoration underline and we don't have anything about party mode. And then we're setting party mode. Oops, I think I accidentally pressed it twice because I pressed space here as well. So let me press that. Wait, what happened to my mouse? Okay, anyways. And now we do get it, right? Underline, text decoration underline and also color red, and you can see that they're all red. But of course, this is pretty stupid, right? Because we're doing the same check twice. But this is one way of doing it, right? Where when you turn off party mode, you actually get rid of the attribute completely. So, and yeah, of course, you can abstract your way around this so that this looks a bit cleaner, probably. But again, I think we've talked about different ways of doing it enough, so I'm trying to be quiet, right? But pretty cool, right? This is the way you could use the array syntax, so you're sort of merging these two different styles. And what were we saying also? Let's say we were saying let's remove the title style specific thing. Let's go back to index.html. Instead of binding this title to the title style, let's bind it directly to party style, like that. And let's refresh, and that should still work. Yep, that still works. And let's I was going to say let's go change from purple because that looks like a link that has been visited, but then I realized whatever, right? It's not relevant. So I guess let's drop that, right? I mean, this is like hopefully that makes sense. You can bind to the style attribute, or you can bind expressions to you can bind reactive expressions to the style attribute of of any HTML element and the components. Actually, that we should do, right? What we should do is we should say, here I've said that the cart item should bind its style attribute to the cart item style. However, this is not very self-contained and not very, oh my god, that word again. Wait, the word was self-contained. Yeah, sorry, the word was self-contained. Okay, that's not very self-contained, because if I have two cart items, let's say that, right? Let's say I double up and I do this whole thing twice, right? We have two lists. Let's put a divider in between them. So let's go back to our application, and then you can see we have two lists here now. Let's actually let's remove the console, or let's close the console. And if I remove the style binding from the second one, and I'll save this and I'll refresh, then you can see the second one is not styled, right? So again, like, this is sort of depending on what you're doing, this might be a feature, but it might also be a potential bug, right? So if you have a scenario where you're saying, I want this component to be self-contained, and this particular styling, this particular switching back and forth between party mode is completely essential to my this component. This is of course silly because it's not, but in our case. But let's say if we had a to-do list, for example. If a to-do like styling what happens to a to-do list element when it's checked might actually be something that really should be part of the to-do list item. And again, then maybe we can have an argument as to whether you should bind to class and then still keep CSS files, or whether you should bind directly to style and then just put your styles in plain JavaScript. That's a different discussion, right? But what we want to do now is we want to get that style attribute into the component, right? So that both of these things render exactly the same. So let's jump into main.js, where we've put our cart item component here in the top. So what we need to do is that we need to say that the li element here is then binding to style, right? Or we're binding the style attribute to something. What are we binding to? Well, ideally, we should be able to just say the same thing. Now, unfortunately, I guess we can't, right? Because of the lengthy discussion we had in the last video, where we talked about, well, inside the component we don't have access to the scope that's outside, which makes perfect sense, right? We don't have access to the parent scope. So we don't actually have access to, let's go to main.js. We don't have access to this data object. We don't have access to neither the base color nor the party color, which means that in order for this thing to actually be self-contained, if we want to be able to reuse this party color thing, we need to treat the view component as a class in an object-oriented sense, or as a function in a functional programming sense, which means we need to pass these things down as props, all of them, right? So we need to pass, let's say, party color, we need to pass base color, and we need to pass party mode, right? Whether we're in party mode or not, right? So then now we're going back to sort of this attribute that we had before in the sort of earlier stages of this particular video, where we had something like is party mode or something like that. So now we've specified the existence of those props. So now let's go over to index.html and actually pass these props, right? So now we need to pass them. So let's say, what do I pass? Well, I pass base color, right? And let's pass that. Sorry, I have to let the cats in. Think about how we can make sure that that's sort of the same across these different components. Hang on. So, so I guess let's do it the messy way first, and then let's move to a more sensible way. So what we would do is that, what we could do is we could just pass the base color here. Let's say the base color is black, and then we say the, what is that, party color? The, party color is red, and then what did we have? Then we have party mode, right? And we have party mode, and that is, okay, and then we need to bind, right? So then we need to say, okay, sorry, I used the binding syntax here. I meant like this, right? We're just passing hard-coded values to these things. But let's say for party mode, we actually want to bind. We want to bind to party, the variable party, in our data object, right? Or in our data model. So let's save that, and let's not think about the second one for now. I'm not sure if that's actually going to give us warnings. Hopefully that's going to give us warnings. Let's refresh this. Let's see what happens. These actually turn out to be, wait, did I save? Refresh. I actually did refresh. Why did these turn out to be purple? That's sort of surprising to me. Let's, because, no, sorry, because I'm still binding to style here. I'm still binding the style attribute to cart item style. Sorry, that's why they were purple. So let's remove that and let's refresh. Now, of course, they're black, right? But of course, because we haven't passed in any styles. Well, we can, or we haven't used these properties that we've passed in. However, what we should be able to see is that these things, I would assume that these things would be actually visible here on these list elements, but actually for some reason they're not. Base color, and party mode. What did I mess up here? Let's go to main.js. We specified that a cart item takes party color, base color, and party mode. Party-color, we're passing red. How confusing. How confusing. Maybe they aren't actually rendered out. Is that the point? No, but that just seems strange, right? If I say foo : bar, let's save that. Let's refresh. Yeah, okay. Sorry. So when you specify that things are props, they're passed in as arguments to the component, in some sense, if you think about that as a function, or as arguments to the constructor, if you think about it as an object, and they're not actually rendered into the HTML. I don't think I've made that realization before in the earlier videos. That was actually pretty interesting, right? So when you make something props, they're not actually rendered out into the HTML. Maybe you can actually config this somehow, right? Because I'm assuming that maybe sometimes that would actually be something that's sought for, but presumably there's a way around that if you want that. But okay, so we can't inspect that we have these passed, but let's assume that we have them passed. What we can do now is we can say we can bind to the style, we can bind an expression to the style attribute inside of the li tag inside the template inside the cart item component, right? So every cart item component, or every instance of a cart item component, will be rendered on the basis of a template. And in this template, we're then specifying that for the li element, we're going to bind to the style attribute. And what we're going to bind to the style attribute is we're going to bind an expression. What's the expression? Well, the expression is pretty simple, right? It's, I mean, we could do it both. Yeah, we could do it both ways, right? We could say, okay, so actually maybe then we don't need the base color, right? Just to simplify, we could do it the other way. We could say party. Can I say dash like this? I think I can say dash, like the party mode prop, and then we're using the ternary syntax. So if party mode is on, then I want to render this object, and then we'll put something in there. If it's not, colon, if it's not, then I'll just render empty string. And then in this object, we'll put color, colon, party color. I'm not actually sure this is going to work. This feels a bit shaky. Let's refresh this. Yeah, we have errors. So I don't think this is unexpected string. Where do we have an unexpected string? I mean, it's line 3, right? But it's like this string is unexpected. What if I pass just an empty object? Does that make sense? No, party. Okay, hang on. So we get a bunch of warnings. Actually, we get a ton of warnings. That was interesting. Okay, whoa. Property or method party is not defined on the instance, but is referred to during render. So here we're not referring to party, right? Let me just make sure. I'm searching for it. No, here we're not referring to party. And actually now we can remove base color. All right, let's remove base color for now. And then let's go back to index.html. Aha, here we are passing in party. I assume that's why. I mean, if I just remove that and then refresh, no, we still have that warning. So it's not at that point, right? But why property or method party is not defined. I'm just reading the error on the instance, but referenced during render. Make sure that this property is reactive. Ah, okay, sorry, wait. What they're saying is that we don't have a property here which is called party, but we do. So I must have messed something up where it's like, because this one clearly does, right? So the root element clearly does. But when I'm binding, it's probably like, maybe I have a different... Wait, I'm so confused. If I, let's just do this, right? Like so whenever I'm super confused about errors, I just start to delete systematically large chunks of code in order to see whether I can eliminate the error or not, right? Because then you know when you've deleted that large chunk that it's in that chunk, and then you can sort of like binary search, right? Then you can sort of split down into one half of that chunk, and if it's in there, you split one half of that chunk and so forth, right? Or you dive into one half of that chunk and so forth. But so let's just remove that chunk and let's see if we get rid of the error, right? So it's definitely in there, and I assume it's in the new stuff and not in the old stuff, right? So like let's remove that and let's refresh. Yeah, then we still have the error, so it's definitely in this new stuff. And if we remove that, then then we still actually have the error. Wait. If I remove that and I'll save, so we have only the old stuff. Yeah, then I have the error. Okay. And if I remove the old stuff and keep the new stuff, then we also have the error. Okay, so it doesn't really matter. Maybe I'll just... Okay, so maybe it's actually in the component. Right, okay, so we're getting... Ooh, sorry, okay. And if I just read the error properly, we could see that they said found in cart item. Okay. So the cart item has an error. So I'm making some kind of mistake here. Let's do this. Let's remove the style here. Let's remove that binding and just not render any styles, right? So clearly it's in there, okay? Which of course maybe was slightly obvious because that's what we were typing when we had the error. So okay. So here's the error. So the error is that I assumed that you could that Vue would convert this kebab case variable to a camel case variable after I've expressed it here. But actually it doesn't, which means that what I'm expressing is actually not the variable party mode, but we're expressing mode, the contents of mode subtracted from the contents of party. Like we're expressing a mathematical expression with party, like party minus mode, right? Which is of course not at all what we're looking for. So the question was, I mean, my confusion was just around, like, we have these props and then you have this sort of kebab notation, like this dash notation, and the question is, when does Vue sort of convert kebab notation to camel case, or kebab case to camel case? And it's then probably when the props are turned into variables that are accessible on the data model. And then in the template, they shouldn't have to do that conversion again, because in the template we could then simply refer to whatever is in the data model and not sort of this kebab notation. So that actually makes perfect sense, and it was a silly mistake from my end. And again, like, if you remember what I said when I wrote this line, I said, ooh, there's too much confusion here, and that was totally part of the confusion. So here I need to say party mode like this, right? Because Vue will probably have converted that automatically, right? Or by convention. And then of course this party color variable probably suffers from the same error. So but we didn't hit that, or maybe we did hit that, I just didn't read all the errors. So let's say party color like this. Let's try this again. Let's see if that works. Ooh, no errors. Let's click the button. And it works, right? It works. So these elements down here, these list items, they turn red when party mode is true, and black when false, right? And interestingly, now we've chosen to do this thing where we're actually either rendering in the property, the CSS property color, or look at the footage, but my computer just like froze for what, like 2 seconds? I don't know what happened. Anyways, I think that's totally the sign that I need to stop recording this video and and turn off. But essentially the point was then that we're using this turning expression to say, well, if party mode is true, then render out this particular CSS stuff. If not, then render out nothing, right? But of course we could have done what we did in the previous section and just say, let's just have this CSS object and say color colon, well, if party mode is true, then it's the party color, and if it's not, then it's the non-party color, right? And so forth. But anyways, now you can see how we've sort of we've made a very reusable component where without hard coding the colors. Like we could have hard coded the colors, but we opted for passing the colors down into the component, right? And let me remove the base color from here. And now this means that we can sort of duplicate this whole list. And of course, if we pass in similar colors, then we will have the same colors in both of them. But of course, now we could pass different colors between them, right? And now you can see both enter party mode, but they have different colors. And this is like, now we're really starting to see the power of components, the power of reusability, and the power of composability, right? Because now we can use components and vary them slightly, and then use components to compose, like use small components to compose larger components, and then use those larger components to compose even larger components, and so forth, right? And of course, we could have bound here when we said red or when we said blue, we could have just bound party color instead and bound it to the variable, let's say party color that we had here in main.js. Here in the root, in the sort of root component, we have this party color value, right? Or party color property. So let's refresh, and that still works. Then we're going on the basis of that variable. Okay, so I think in the interest of time and the interest of, let's see if my computer even survived this recording, I'll cut here, but there are 2 sections as well here in the guide, and those are, but I'll actually skip these. But they are about vendor prefixes, right? So like when you have like the browser specific implementations of something or of a CSS property before that CSS property has become an accepted standard, or like before we even know if it's going to be an accepted standard or not. And I'm actually a bit confused about this, right? If somebody knows exactly what's going on here, they can please do clarify something in the comments, right? Because it seems like they're saying auto-prefixing, right? It's like, to me, it just seems that these 2 statements are contradictory. Like auto-prefixing seems to say that they will apply vendor prefixes automatically for you whenever you use something which is known to, where prefixes are known, right? Something that they know have prefixes, then they'll just add those prefixes for you. But then here they seem to be saying that you can sort of specify the prefixes yourself, and then only the relevant prefixes are rendered. So I don't know, maybe this has something to do with either this is more experimental, or it's like you can use this second syntax if you want to avoid rendering out a bunch of prefixed values or a bunch of vendor prefixes even when you don't actually need them. But yeah, I mean, it's better that I don't say anything because I don't actually know this. But if you know about that, please do shoot something in the comments. That would be very interesting. Last comment, and then I'll be quiet. One thing that I find very interesting, I didn't have the time to dive deeply into the source code. I tried to search for this, like it was like yesterday or the day before yesterday, because I'm struggling to figure out whether they've, to do this sort of camel case, kebab case conversion, do they just do that automatically, or like do they just assume that everything in CSS is expressed as kebab case and then they convert that to camel case? So whenever you have something camel case, they can just blindly convert that to kebab case and then match up the CSS property, or do they actually have like a full list of every CSS property and only convert those, right? Because that begs me the question, if not, what if there exists a CSS property that is not kebab case, that isn't sort of delimited with dashes, but rather is expressed as in terms of camel case? Then yeah, I don't know, maybe that's an exception. But then they need to code that exception in. I'd be interested in figuring out what that looks like, right? So maybe if I have the time, I'll dive into the source code, and then at some point during the series, maybe we'll talk about that. But if you do know that already, please do shoot something in the comments. And yeah, So maybe we'll see that in the future. Anyways, I hope this makes a ton of sense. And in the next video, we will now dive into conditional rendering. But before we do that, we will simply rewrite a new application where we'll build sort of this simple to-do application and then just work with that from scratch so that you have something that is a bit more simple. I'm super glad to have all you avid commenters with me along on this journey of diving deeply and like not thoroughly, harshly, the hard way, like hard way into Vue.js because it feels like it's starting to make a ton of sense now, and I feel like we're going to be really good at Vue.js when we leave this series. Anyways, I'm glad to have you along on this journey. Remember to let me know if there's anything I can make better in the future videos, and otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.